Hello, thank you for joining us at Love Food, Hate Money, the show where we talk about food and how much money we spend on it, because that's the only hobby we have. I'm host Jonah. He's going to be co-host Courtney.
Hey.
And we will jump into our drinks for the day. We are rocking a beautiful Earl Grey. That's the name of the tea. I almost said chai tea. Earl Grey tea from Private Select. The best money can buy.
So fancy.
Very fancy. There's nothing like bergamot oil and tea leaves that have been there for who knows how long, because it's Fry's tea, and that doesn't scream quality. But
because sometimes you go out and you spend all your money and then you drink cheap tea to make up for it.
It's all about balance.
And it's also like we're getting close to bedtime. Tea is a good bedtime ritual.
Yeah, nothing like a little hit of caffeine right before bed.
I think so. I sleep better after I have a little caffeine.
Yeah, addiction is bad, kids.
Don't do drugs.
Don't do drugs. Unless it's caffeine, because that's the drug that we've approved of. It's a
weird thing.
Like, obviously, we all run on caffeine, like, unless you're
disciplined.
Yeah.
Kudos to you.
Good on you, drinking water and being all healthy. But for those of us that aren't disciplined, the caffeine really, really do be helping.
True. So what are we talking about today?
Today, we're going to talk about your favorite food.
My favorite food?
My favorite food, too, I think.
Yeah.
Probably.
What would maybe be your other favorite food?
Well, like, pizza's great.
Pizza is great.
It depends on, like, the cheese intake for the day. If it's a cheese day, pizza. If it's a no cheese day, ramen.
Then it's ramen day. Ramen's a fun one because I feel like it's something that we've kind of teased a couple times. And then obviously, like, our current logo is bowls of ramen that we had in Japan.
Food that I aspire to be.
You want to be a bowl of ramen?
Yeah, I want to be a bowl of hot broth with some nudes on the side.
One of the reasons that we figured this was a good time for this topic is we recently went to San Diego, and we're going again next week because we have problems.
Beach, let's go to the beach.
But we had really hyped up this ramen shop that was like Michelin recommended, and we were so stoked to try it. And then we went there.
And we were pretty disappointed.
And we had hyped it up so much in our minds. And
which part of that is probably on us. Because
that's our fault.
We weren't meeting the ramen where it was at. And that's an us problem.
We all have a ramen shaped hole in our hearts.
And it did not fill my ramen hole.
Okay. So ramen is one of those things, like, we had very little experience eating it prior to going to Japan.
I don't know what you're talking about, but go on. I mean, I know what you're talking about, but I ate a butt ton of ramen growing up.
Cup noodles, instant noodles, top ramen, that falls into a different category for me.
You know, and you can tell that it's ramen because it's got top and then the word ramen. It's the top, baby.
And that's honestly, there's enough information there to do a whole episode, because top ramen and cup of noodles is super interesting. The history is
revolutionized the world, baby.
Yeah. But that's not the ramen I'm talking about. I'm talking about go to a restaurant, sit down, order a bowl of ramen.
Yeah, a real ramen yacht experience.
Yes.
Versus the top ramen experience, which is to not be discredited, because top ramen is fantastic.
No, it's good for what it is. Like, it serves its purpose, but that's not.
And even for not its purpose, because I was one of the kids that grew up and would open up the baggie. My cousins and I would do this. We'd open up the baggie, and then we would pour the powder in, and then you just beat the hell out of it until you get all these little dry ramen shards that I don't think you were supposed to eat like that, because they're not technically cooked all the way.
It's deep fried.
Deep fried?
Yeah. So yeah. No, you can eat it that way.
I think on the package it says not to do it that way, though. It just, we were being bad little boys.
It also says don't eat cookie dough out of the package, but...
Well, because cookies are dangerous, and so is top ramen.
Which most people don't understand. It's not the eggs they're talking about, it's the flour.
Yeah, flour gets people more sick than the eggs these days.
Because flour is kind of gross before it's cooked. But anyways... We'd really only eaten maybe 2 or 3 ramen shops locally and then one in LA before we had gone to Japan. And when we were in Japan, I want to say in the 2 weeks we were there, we ate anywhere from 20 to 25 different bowls of ramen.
Yeah, we had ramen every day.
And multiple times a day.
And usually we would have, and some of the days were days where we specifically went to like a ramen museum, or we were stopping in at the ramen street in Tokyo Station. So there was, the museum, I think, had 20 different shops in it. I don't think what was it, 12? Probably 12 different shops? No, I think
they have 6.
No, there was
Yeah, I'm on their website. I'll pull it up.
Guess I'm wrong. Maybe.
Yeah, 5.
There's only 5 in rotation? I feel like there was more when we were there.
There might have been, but their current situation is 5.
As a post-pandemic world, or during pandemic world, I don't know. We went pre-pandemic.
It was not as big as you remember it, but I appreciate your enthusiasm.
That whole street was a world of possibilities.
Right. So, yeah, we went to the Yokohama Ramen Museum.
I think it's worth noting as well that when we went into this trip, we were like, we don't want to be the people that come back and say we can't get a decent bowl of ramen anywhere.
Yeah, we failed that miserably.
And now
we're bad people.
We're really, really assholes about it. I think we're polite assholes about it, but there is a part of it where we just have a bowl of ramen at a shop and we're like, yep, that doesn't have that's not what I was looking for exactly, which...
It's hard because you have this food memory now. And every time you go out and try to chase that memory, it's just not going to end well.
Yeah.
And not to say that there aren't places that do a good job or that we prefer more than others, but it's really hard to go from a country where that is like one of their most famous dishes to here where getting all of the ingredients or spending the time to make the ramen may not be doable or even necessary to feed the audience that's going to be eating it.
Yeah, and all of it that we've had, which again, Metro Phoenix doesn't have a ton of ramen shops. I'd say the only one that comes close is Origami.
I really like Origami.
So shout out to them. They also use way more black pepper than you will see in the entire country of Japan at any given moment. Like, I can't remember that spice in Japan. And they put on enough black pepper into their like house ramen that it makes me happy because I grew up eating like Kraft mac and cheese with just enough black pepper to it kind of looked like a pepper coated salami.
Yes.
By the time I was done with it, which is the sweet spot, and they use a ton of it. It's delicious.
Yeah, so we figured we'd give you a little bit of the history that we learned when we were at the Shin Yokohama Ramen Museum, because that was really, for me, what made that place stand out so much was it was like, actually, like, this is the history of it, and it's not our dish originally. Ramen originates from Chinese noodle soup. It was around 1859 when the Japanese opened their ports. And around that same time...
Welcome back to the world.
Around that same
Isolation
time...
Island.
There was a Chinese noodle shop that had opened. And that's really what sparked it. And it's funny because if you go and read up on ramen history, one of the big things was when Chinese people would visit Japan, they were like, we're not eating raw fish. Like, we're not doing that.
This is not a
This
fun
is not
game.
how you do it.
This is how we get sick.
We cannot eat this. So ramen was one of the things that kind of came out of that is like the Chinese people were like, no, like, look at this. We eat this. This is pretty cool, right? And
we see your food that you didn't cook and we'll raise you cooked food.
The most cooked food, because I mean, most ramen broths that are going to be worth their weight are going to be 10 hours on the stove.
Does it talk about how there's probably a full circle element there where the fish is being taken off for, you know, sushi, various other dishes and consumed differently, and then they're taking those bones and they're like, oh, we'll just cook it and make a stock out of it? Like, does it talk about how full circle that
I didn't read anything about that, but I do think that's an interesting point to make, because one of the great things about ramen is you can use a lot of scraps. Like when I make it at home, and that's not often because it takes 4 days, like I save chicken bones in the freezer.
All bones.
For weeks and weeks and weeks. And if I was going to do the fish stock, I would do the same. So yeah, I guess you could totally it depends on the fish.
That's true.
Like typically you wouldn't take like salmon bones.
Salmon's also not something that is actually that Japanese, though. That was some great marketing by the Norwegians.
Targeted Japan. This is some more fun trivia. They targeted Japan because at the time they had an overabundance of salmon. And they were like, they eat raw fish. I bet we could get them to buy our fish. And it worked.
And now we have salmon rolls to this day, which good on people that can eat them, because
it's not my favorite.
Salmon is a flavor that I do not like raw that much. I'll eat a salmon roll, but like overall, prefer to hit it out with a little bit of a sear.
Mm-hmm.
And that's me on ramen.
And this just became the sushi episode. So if you go to the ramen museum, which if you go to Japan, take the time to do it. I think it was like $3.50 for entry. And then they expect you to buy at least one ball of ramen
per shop.
One bowl of ramen. So essentially the layout of this museum is the whole top floor is the museum. You're reading history. You're looking at
you walk through. I remember there being like a glass an enclosure thing, almost like a little diorama, and then a bunch of dates, and you walked in. You were walking down the timeline of ramen,
mm-hmm.
and this is what one of the little ramen carts would have looked like, and this is what the first electric ramen water boiler looked like.
Yeah, very cool, very insightful, especially because they really touch on the tools that it takes to make ramen, like you're saying, mm-hmm. and then also kind of the regionality of it. Because I think what makes ramen so interesting is that every region has really done a spinoff, mm-hmm. and you could have it in Hokkaido and it's going to be one thing, and then you're going to have it in Tokyo and it could be 6 or 8 different things because it's so much more access to ingredients.
Right. What ingredients were being brought in to the ports was going to be pretty different, or even the seaweed that's being used, because a lot of that stuff the seaweed does contribute a pretty significant flavor to the dashis.
Mm-hmm. And then even the variants of noodles, and just from the Ramen Museum website, they cite 5 different noodles specifically, and each noodle is
5 mother noodles.
Each noodle is supposed to go with a certain type of broth, and it's very thoughtful. And I think that's why I enjoy it so much, is because there's so much variation, but at the end of the day, it's usually the same 6 ingredients in the bowl, but it can be very different. And then the bottom of the museum was an arguable amount of ramen shops, because we can't agree on how many there were.
There were lots of shops, more shops than you can order full bowls at, which is another fun part of it, because you could order half bowls at pretty much every shop, which is not something you can really do outside of that context.
Because their whole thing was they bring in shops from around Japan, and then they bring shops from around the world. So we were fortunate enough to go when they had a shop from Canada that was doing...
We were fortunate, and then we were unfortunate.
Well, then we were stupid. But they were doing a chicken-based soup. Mm-hmm. Very reminiscent of a really fatty chicken noodle soup.
Which is delicious.
Excellent. And then, of course, after the fact, we read the full menu and found out you could add maple butter to your bowl of ramen.
So if you ever have the opportunity to get Canadian maple butter ramen and actually get it with the maple butter, shout out to us, because that was a sad mistake on our part.
That was a big miss for us. One of the other ones we had, which is so crazy to me, is we had the rarest bowl of ramen in the world.
Yeah. According to the literature.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this shop specifically, it's in Hokkaido, which is the hardest part of Japan to even get to, first of all.
You have to, I don't know if hardest is right, but it's the most northern island.
Right.
On the Japanese archipelago.
And they use seaweed that's local there. So it grows in really cold water, which gives it its distinct flavor. And the shop is only open 3 hours a day, 3 days a week.
I want to know how they got to the point where they could open the shop and say, we're open 9 hours a week. Every other time, tough titties.
Yeah. That would be a dream, honestly.
I'm trying to think of the logistics on that. If we were going to do that right now, open up a shop that we only had to be open for a 9-hour window, we would have to charge.
Well, especially with ramen, because That's hands-on. That's a lot of work.
Yeah. It's a lot of front-loaded work.
Yeah. I mean, yes, assembling a bowl is very quick, which is why it's such a great commuter lunch. It's why it's so popular.
You got hot broth. You just got to get them noodles up to temperature, into the right temperature. I think that's a thing that you brought up that I really like about anything is I like lots of convenience food in general, but then I also like the opposite end of the spectrum where anything that you can put more thought than you should into is really fun. Whether it be, all right, so I've got this thick soup, so it's going to go with this thick noodle because thick likes thick.
True.
And nice. Or you got this thinner broth, this lighter broth, so it's going to go with these thinner noodles. Or I've got, this broth, so we're going to use wrinkly noodles instead.
Yeah.
And the variations and just the thought that goes behind it is lots of fun. Which, this is off topic, but I learned about a Czechoslovakian Czech beer drinking tradition the other day.
You're obsessed with this.
It's great. I'll have some. You're the person that puts the information online.
Yes, I will link it in the description.
It's great, but there's some bars in the United States now that are adopting this Czech beer tending tradition of incorporating foam and like the various amounts of foam. And there's a shop that's only going to have like 2 beers, but 5 different foam level variations. So they're doing 10 different pours. And they're pairing that with food based on textures. And I think that's super interesting. And it's relevant to ramen because foam and textures.
Well, I think it's also relevant to ramen in the sense of even just drinking culture with ramen in Japan and drinking highballs. And
highball culture is
having that super
big fan
effervescent beverage is almost like a palate cleanser while you're eating your food.
Mm-hmm.
Is really enjoyable, and I don't feel like you can get that here.
Yeah, not very many spots have the specialized highball machines. Some of them are starting to get highball machines in Arizona, which is exciting.
And then if they do, they don't have ramen, and then it's like a whole thing. But anyways.
That's a separate sadness. The highball culture, that drinking culture is interesting to think about because there's intentionality with each drink and bite. And if I remember correctly, I can't remember if it's a Japanese tradition, but there's a form of eating called triangular eating. And it's like the process of I'm going to have a bite of this and I'm going to take a drink of that and how all of that plays into each other in the overall experience.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's something...
turns it into a much higher art form than just eating, even though you're just eating.
Right. Well, I think like even Tsukemen ramen really like plays off of that because... So if you look at our logo, that is from a shop that was celebrating their anniversary. So you could get 2 bowls of ramen for like, I think it was like maybe $20 each of us.
It was something like
that.
It wasn't they had crazy. A special where it was the 2 sets for and it was like an anniversary set too. Yes. Like it was a specialized, the broth was richer and cooked longer. So it had more umami.
They showed the original recipe that they had started with. And then they were showing the one that they...
the ultra-rich anniversary.
Yeah. And the way that you eat Tsukemen ramen is the soup is really hot, but the noodles are chilled. And I have a weird thing with temperature, so I didn't think I was going to like it. But you take the cold noodles, you dip them in the hot soup, and you slurp them. And when I tell you that is one of the most enjoyable foods to eat because of the texture and the taste and the temperature, like it's just so...
The Tsukemen noodles specifically had
they're so chewy.
A really pleasant chew, which I'm pretty sure the word is Taiwanese that I'm about to use is QQ. But yeah. It's like an onomatopoeia
it's like a
for them, whereas that really bouncy texture, but pleasantly bouncy and not like calamari bouncy where it fights back.
No.
But those were delicious. It was also like Tsukemen's style broth and soup is different because the noodles aren't resting in it. They pack extra flavor into
rich it and thick.
So it was thicker and it was richer and it was. I think the reason we're assholes about ramen now is that the umami level just isn't there at all for any of the food. Like there's not that level of umami or depth in any of the ramens that we've had in the United States. There was the one shop in LA that was pretty good.
Yeah, and I don't remember what it was called. I'll have to look at my itinerary from that trip.
Archives.
Because I do remember that one being really good. I think also just having the option to try so many variants, because like the Ramen Museum had multiple kinds that you could try in one place. And then when Tokyo Station underwent their renovation, they opened Tokyo Ramen Street, where they offered space to, I think it was like 6 shops that were really well known across the country to come in, open another location, and showcase the ramen that they were known for. I think we went to 4 of them.
Yeah, that sounds right. We went a lot.
We any chance we got to go back there, we did. Simply because it made it easy for us, right? We didn't have to do as much research when you kept going back to the same area and knowing there was another shop next door to try. But I know we had different favorites.
Yeah. My favorite was one that I will discuss with the trigger warning, because the things I'm about to say are kind of gross, but it was delicious. It was like a sardine focused ramen that was so fishy and sardiny and oily umami that it was like gritty.
It was, yeah, like
you could
a little murky.
It was
kind of thick.
Sardine sludge, the ramen. But when I tell you that it had so much depth of flavor and umami, and even that like grit as a part of the texture was fantastic. I don't think I sold anyone on it, but you gotta, it hit different.
It was really good.
You really liked it, and it was texturally also upsetting to you. Like, the flavor was so good that the upsetting texture was
You could
passable.
get around it because it tasted so good.
It reminded me of watching food anime where, like, the bad flavors are happening, but you're like, kind of like it.
Whereas, like, for me, my favorite bowl that we had was a miso ramen that was super garlicky. Like, their whole thing was that they made this miso garlic paste that they put on top of your ramen bowl. Mm-hmm. And it had these big, thick, chewy noodles, and the broth was thicker. And it reminded me almost of eating, like, Italian food, just texturally, because it was like eating pasta more so than eating a soup. Mm-hmm. And for me, that's like...
It was good. Very garlicky.
So unctuous and rich and creamy and delicious.
I mean, you've started putting miso into any of your garlic pastas now since then.
I put miso in everything.
Yeah. Adds depth.
Like, even just, I made a vegan pesto over the weekend. You just throw a little bit of miso paste in there to replace the Parmesan, and it's...
That was on a TV show, I swear. I don't remember which one.
I think it was 2, but yeah. It's so good. So I think the challenge is now of, like, how do you appreciate a food that you feel like you can't get without being a snob about it?
Yep. Let us know how to do that, because I don't know how. I don't know. There's a certain part. I think it's funny that we were just watching Ugly Delicious, and a lot of those episodes, Shane is going to Tokyo because he's lived in Tokyo and stuff, and it's funny to see them talk about appreciation of culture in Japan, like taking different foods and then making it their own, and then talking about like the struggles of like, okay, what is authenticity?
Sure.
And even in the context of ramen, like if you go to the ramen museum, they give the nod of the hat to the Chinese noodle soup and say like, this is where it came from. I think also in that same website or that same story on the page, it goes on to say that the emphasis on umami is what differentiates it, and what they focused on. They focused on the umami in the soup, and that is where you get all of the derivatives of like, okay, this umami and this, umami from the miso is going to be different than the umami from the dashi, is going to be different than the umami from soy.
Shio.
It's different from the umami from just the regular salt. So the amount of, that's what they accredit to like making it their own.
What makes it Japanese. And I think that's an interesting point about Japanese food as a whole, is they tend to take one ingredient and try to really showcase it to its full extent, which is why I think having the different variations of ramen is so interesting. So you have shoyu, shio, tonkatsu, which is pork, Miso.
And then there's a couple other derivatives based on like, there's another worth of these for the chicken-based soups, and there's also the fish-based soups.
Yeah.
Don't know the actual words for those ones, but those are separate.
But really,
Mother stocks.
They take the one component and they're like, this is what we're going to layer the flavor off of. Mm-hmm. And I think it's that focus that makes it so special. Mm-hmm. And I think when you take that time and effort to make it that way is where it really shines. And I think that's the hard part of translating it out here if that's not the only thing you serve.
Right. I think that a lot of places could benefit in general from just focus, because I feel like a lot of the ramen shops we've been to in the United States, they have a shio, they have a shoyu, they have a miso, they have a tenkatsu,
they're trying to hit everybody.
They have the entire spectrum of them, and none of them are actually that good. Whereas if you just focused in on like a shoyu and did that well, I think that places would benefit. I think that we talked about that in general, though, where we wish that specialized food in the United States was a thing. Like,
have a shop that just serves one thing and make it like the best version.
Raising Cane's, baby.
Oh no.
One love, brother.
No. And I think it's also interesting too to talk about the components of ramen, because I think a lot of people assume it's a broth, noodles, and toppings, when in reality you've got the tare, which is a flavored oil that usually goes in the bottom of a bowl. You've got,
and they use the tiniest little ladles. They're very cute.
And then you've got the stock, and it depends on what kind of ramen you're having. It could also be a double soup. And in that case, you would make usually a dashi, which is a soup made of like kombu and like fish flakes. And then you might have like a pork stock or a chicken stock or a fish stock that blends with that. And then you have your noodles, and then you have some kind of fat on top, whether that's sesame.
Fat on top is important to note. It's
probably the most important thing
that we miss here, because fat carries flavor, and there's a lot of United States mindset is like, well, it's fat, so it's going to make it heavy, so we're going to skim the fat off.
No,
you just took away the insulation layer.
That's what keeps it so hot.
And then just all that flavor, like the flavor of those fats is very different and hard to create. You lose a lot when you lose that flavor, because that flavor isn't just the flavor of pork. It's like being hugged by a pig. It's a nice little warm, like, I'm dead and that's okay, and it hugs you back.
No. A lot of times it's animal-based fats, sometimes it's plant-based fats.
It's like being hugged by a dead sesame seed. All 8 million of them.
And then, of course, from there you have toppings, and toppings really vary. I love chashu pork. I think that should be on everything that you eat.
Chashu is good.
All the time. And the egg is really important to me. If you're going to serve it and it's hard boiled, I'm going to be sad.
Yeah, the seasoned egg, I like the seasoned egg when they are slightly warm. And if that's them just like pulling it from the marinade and then in the oil or the soup for just a second to help bring it up, instead of just like popping into it and it being cold but runny, because cold but runny is kind of
it's a weird thing. If you push it under the soup long enough, though, it'll be okay.
Just brown the egg. You're like, oh, you're not right.
And I think another thing that happens a lot in the shops that we've been to in the US is that they load it up with toppings as a way to almost like offset the fact that like this soup could use more flavor.
Yeah, I think that was this issue that I had with the spot in San Diego that we went to, is that they really did have quality toppings, but all of them were slightly underseasoned, and then the soup was also slightly underseasoned, so there was nothing to like help bring it back up. But like, I remember the green onion specifically being like really beautiful and curly and satisfying, and their egg had good flavor, good texture, and there was like a lot done correct. It just was done
if you
muted.
Don't nail the soup, like it's going to be a flat dish. And I think also, and I'm going to tease another episode here as we run out of time, anybody that brags about not using MSG is kind of a red flag for me. If you want to hear about more of that now, I actually did an episode for the Disinformed podcast about the history of MSG. Not to say that you need it to make a good bowl of ramen. When I make ramen at home, I don't use it because you spend enough time to pull that umami out of the ingredients. But I think had that bowl had MSG in it, it would have been 10 times better.
I don't like the no MSG advertising just because it perpetuates racist stereotyping, and that, like, you just don't do MSG, but you don't have to, like, contribute to white people being afraid of MSG. Like, that's a really...
It goes back to even the Chinese roots of ramen, and then being like, we don't use MSG. Okay, well, now you're, like, feeding into the Chinese restaurant syndrome nightmare. And it's like, stop. Which
is also part of what we were watching on Ugly Delicious. I'm talking about MSG.
It's a great episode.
It's just David Chang being a herald for MSG. And, like, people are just fucking uneducated on this, like, grossly.
Yep.
Because you eat it daily. If you're eating snack foods in the United States, like, the number one seasoning is MSG. Just because it doesn't say MSG and it's spelled out as monosodium glutamate doesn't mean it's not MSG.
And MSG is in breast milk, and I'll leave it at that.
Tough titties, nerds.
Well, but we'll circle back to that because I think it's a really interesting conversation. It's something that I've spent a lot of time reading up on because I feel like anytime we have an opportunity to dispel myths about food, and especially myths that are racist, just blatantly racist, we should do that.
Yeah, food is one of the most interesting things because it is culture. Like, it is as much culture as anything else, and it brings people together and it divides people just as much. And it's a fun thing to actually, like, think about and, like, oh, there's food that we associate as Chinese food that doesn't exist without Portuguese people coming through and bringing in chili peppers, and we don't have mala cooking in China without South America and chilies that are not native to China, but hundreds of years pass, and that's just a part of the culture. It's steep, man.
It's really cool.
And ramen is Chinese food.
Now we're gonna get canceled.
Nice. And on that note, the ramen police are banging down the door. I'm gonna go off to ramen jail.
Oh, you would like ramen jail. Do you get to eat ramen every day?
Yeah. I'll end this. I'll drop the egg soap.
Okay.
We'll have to keep talking about ramen later on. That we scratched the surface.
Barely, and that's the hard part about talking about one type of food, especially to try to do it in like 30 minutes, is there's just not enough time.
We can talk about it more later.
We are gonna make this a multi-pack ramen explosion experience.
We're gonna give all my favorite ramen recipes, including how to smash ramen and pour your little packet on it.
Thank you for listening to Love Food, Hate Money. This episode and every episode is edited by John Watkins of Feathered Fiction Studios. He also does our original music. Thanks, John. If you want to connect with us, check us out on Instagram and all your other favorite social media platforms. You can email us at hello@lovefoodhatemoney.com. And please send us your industry stories if you want to.
Or don't, because that's what you've been doing. That is fine too.
And then if you or somebody you know would be a great guest for our show, hit us up. We have really, really enjoyed doing those interviews. We hope to do more. And even if you're out of state, like, we can figure that out, set that up. So
we can give John a headache.
Tell all your chef friends to be our new friends.
Or your Starbucks baristas, or your Dutch Bros baristas, because I want one of those in the show for a 15-minute special. On just how much cocaine do you have to do to get that revved up at any given point.
And we just want to say thank you so much for listening. We've really had a great time with this. It's been so fun to see it grow, and we hope to continue to talk at more of you every week.
We love talking at you. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
I made a mess.